In Victorian Britain, a milk seller could be prosecuted for selling milk that had been diluted with water, and Parliament knew that some traders were adding roughly 1 part water to 4 parts milk. Here is why that was actually the law. For poor families, children, older people, and the sick, milk was an important source of nourishment. Yet Victorian analysts repeatedly found milk that had been watered down or skimmed, sometimes both. In 1870, Parliament heard that a gallon of good milk contained about 9,400 grains of solid nutriment, while some poor London milk supplied only 6,800 to 7,000. The water was therefore reducing the food value customers were paying for. Adulteration was fraud because the buyer thought they were purchasing genuine milk. It was also a public health concern because poorer consumers were most exposed to the inferior product. Britain had already passed food adulteration laws in 1860, 1867, and 1872, but enforcement remained uneven. The 1875 Sale of Food and Drugs Act strengthened the system and specifically addressed the sale of food that had been adulterated or had valuable ingredients removed. And here is the part that sounds almost like a joke. In Parliament, one speaker described the old trade practice as adding 25% water to milk. Another cited an even more extreme example from Dublin, where the alleged custom had been 2 gallons of water added to every gallon of milk before the law began to bite. Imagine being handed a glass and being told it was milk when the arithmetic behind it looked more like a plumbing project. But the battle did not end there. Because once milk could be diluted, every other ordinary food suddenly became a target for the same trick, and the next offender was sitting inside almost every Victorian kitchen. Bread looked safer than milk. It wasn't. Victorian law increasingly targeted bread made from deliberately inferior or altered flour, including the use of alum. Today, alum sounds like something from a chemistry cupboard. But Victorian reformers were concerned because it could help bakers produce acceptable-looking bread from poorer quality flour. It was that adulteration could hide the poor quality of what customers were actually buying. Parliament discussed the practice bluntly in 1875. Supporters of the new legislation argued that earlier food laws had helped condemn the trade practice of mixing alum into flour and then selling poor bread to working-class customers. The logic was straightforward. If a baker could disguise inferior material and charge people as though it were ordinary bread, the customer was being cheated. The law also reflected a larger change in Victorian government. Instead of relying entirely on a buyer to notice something was wrong, local authorities could appoint analysts and take samples for chemical examination. In the 19th century, it meant a loaf could become evidence for court, and the enforcement could become surprisingly technical. The 1875 Act created rules about what counted as an offense, how samples were handled, and when a seller could defend himself by showing that an article had been supplied under warranty. In other words, the courtroom might end up debating not whether a loaf looked like bread, but whether its ingredients and chain of supply could survive laboratory scrutiny. Try explaining to a Victorian baker that the person judging his loaf was not a customer, but a government analyst carrying a sample bottle. But bread was only the beginning. If officials were prepared to put ordinary groceries under the microscope, drinks were about to become equally dangerous territory, and one of Britain's favorite beverages had a particularly creative problem. Coffee could be sold in Victorian Britain with something very different hiding inside it. The adulteration laws were aimed at more than milk. Parliament heard that coffee and mustard were often heavily mixed with other substances, while tea could also arrive in adulterated form. The reason was brutally practical. Genuine ingredients cost money, and cheaper additions could stretch a seller's stock while leaving the customer believing they had bought the real thing. In a 1875 parliamentary debate, supporters of stronger enforcement pointed to coffee and mustard as examples that had previously been much mixed. The proposed solution was not to ban every mixture. If a product was intentionally sold as a mixture for the convenience of buyer and seller, the important point was that the fact had to be disclosed by proper labeling. Victorian law was not trying to make every unusual recipe criminal. It was trying to stop sellers from quietly changing a product while charging the customer as though nothing had changed. Earlier investigations showed just how widespread the problem could be. In 1873, Parliament was told about an analyst's report from St. George, Hanover Square. Of 20 milk samples examined, only 5 were genuine, while some had been watered and skimmed. The same report found that only 4 of 15 ground coffee samples were genuine, with others containing additions such as chicory and caramel. That is a remarkably bad scorecard for a shop shelf. The new system therefore turned chemistry into a form of consumer protection. Samples could be examined, sellers could face proceedings, and local officials could bring cases before magistrates. The absurdity was that an everyday purchase could now become a miniature scientific investigation. And if you think adulterating coffee was inventive, wait until you see what happened when traders tried to make cheap butter look expensive. Butter created a different Victorian problem. Sometimes the trick was not adding something obvious, but making a substitute appear to be the real thing. Parliament's debates repeatedly returned to the basic principle that a customer should know what was actually being sold. This became especially important with products such as butter, lard, cheese, and milk. By the 1880s, Parliament was still discussing prosecutions under the 1875 Act, showing that passing a law had not magically solved the problem. In 1888, for example, the Commons discussed disputes over lard prosecutions in which local analysts' conclusions had been challenged by further analysis at Somerset House. The law even allowed a defendant to request a further examination when the accuracy of the first analysis was questioned. That detail reveals how strange food enforcement could become. A shopkeeper might not be arguing that the law did not apply to him. He could be arguing about chemistry, laboratory results, sampling procedure, and whether one government analyst's conclusion should defeat another. Try to imagine standing before a Victorian magistrate because your lard sample had become a scientific controversy. Local authorities varied in how enthusiastically they pursued adulterators, and by the 1890s, Parliament heard complaints that some towns were so reluctant to act that consumers had formed organizations to investigate sellers themselves. In 1898, one member described these groups as effectively creating their own private police to pursue adulteration cases, including cases involving milk that was reported to contain as much as 50% water. So the strangest consequence was not that Victorian Britain had food laws. It was that enforcing them could turn shoppers into investigators, analysts into witnesses, and a pint of milk into courtroom evidence. But one twist made the entire system even stranger, and it involved the word genuine. The most ironic part of Victorian food law was that the government sometimes had to police a food that had been quietly made less valuable. The real target was deception. Milk became the example because the fraud could be almost invisible. Add water, and the bottle still looked like milk. Remove cream, and it still looked like milk. The customer paid for one thing while receiving something poorer. Parliament had already heard the scale of the problem. In 1875, a speaker warned that adding 25% water to milk had become a trade practice before earlier legislation condemned it. Another parliamentary account from Dublin described a custom of adding 2 gallons of water to every gallon of milk. Whether every seller followed such practices is another question, but the fact that Parliament was discussing those figures tells you how seriously the issue had become. And that is why a harmless-looking jug could become the most suspicious object on a Victorian doorstep, and the consequences could reach beyond the seller. In 1898, Parliament heard that adulteration was especially concentrated in poorer districts, where consumers had fewer choices and less power to challenge what they were sold. Some local authorities were criticized for weak enforcement, while private consumer organizations stepped in and pursued convictions themselves. That is the real Victorian twist. The law did not merely tell people what they could eat. It tried to define what a seller was allowed to call food. A bottle could look completely normal and still be legally wrong. For generations, governments have tried to control tiny everyday behaviors when those behaviors affect money, health, or public trust. Victorian Britain simply discovered that sometimes the most suspicious object in town was an ordinary milk jug. Which of these 5 food rules would surprise you most today? Tell me in the comments.